We're going to rush straight to South Africa now, and I will invite Andries DuToit to talk us through his paper.
So, hi, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, 7 minutes to talk about the pattern of growth and the distribution of equity in South Africa. I'm just going to highlight some of the key points in my paper. And in a way, I want to start by pointing out that the issue of the pattern of growth and equity in South Africa is at the heart of a very serious quandary that we face as a society. In 1994, with the transition to democracy, we knew very well that we were one of the most unequal societies on the face of the planet, with a very, very high Gini coefficient for income, around about 0.65, 0.67, thereabouts. But this was not, for us at the time, cause for too much despondency. We believed we understood the reasons for this very high Gini. Surely it was caused mainly by the regressive, irrational, counterproductive, racist policies of apartheid. And didn't we have a government in power, which the raison d'etre of this government was dealing with this legacy, transforming South African society in a more egalitarian way. And although one knew that there might be limits on the extent of this transformation, limits to the change, there was every reason for believing that within 10, 15, 20 years, things would be looking at least a little bit better. Well, in the field of poverty and inequality, at the very least, that hope has proved ill-founded. 10 years, 15 years after the transition to democracy, we find that our poverty figures have essentially remained the same, or they've improved only marginally, and inequality has indeed worsened. The Gini going up between 2000 and 2005 from about 0.67 to 0.7, 3 percentage points in 5 years, which is quite a big move for a relatively immobile indicator like a Gini. So I think part of the answer for this lies in looking again at South African history. Now, conventionally, accounts of history in South Africa tend to emphasize change and discontinuity, and particularly they tend to emphasize political transition. The rise to power of the Afrikaner Nationalist Party in 1948, that having the party's fingers prized off the levers of power in 1994, these are supposed to be the big markers. But if you look at things from the point of view of the distributional regime and the nature of inequality in society, what emerges is continuities and the existence of fairly durable structures in society. And the key moments that I would fasten your attention on, if you want to understand the origins of this distributional regime, is firstly South Africa's mineral revolution in the late 19th century. And the rise of economic order essentially centered around the mineral energy complex and the reliance of that complex on enormously coercive relations of enormously unequal and enormously coercive economic relations. Its need for a very cheap and docile African labor force, for instance. Secondly, the formation of the modern South African state and struggles around the place within the distributional regime of the state of the industrial working class between about 1910 to about 1922, which created a social and political order which made enormously deep and fateful difference between economic insiders, who were usually in the cities, and economic outsiders in the rural areas, in the former homeland areas. And finally, I want to emphasize a continuity that exists at the level of ideology, at the level of discourse. The persistence of narratives that link notions of development and growth to enormously normative and Eurocentric notions of modernity and global integration. So that if you were to read the words of the Afrikaner Nationalist Commissioner of Native Affairs, what he thought about native farmers, to use the politically incorrect term, in 1948, and listen to our new Minister of Rural Development, Land Reform, Ngile Nkwinti, talking about the problems of smallholder farming, in South Africa today, given small changes in the politically incorrect language, the message is basically the same. So enormous continuity around these discourses around modernity. What I want to highlight, we were asked in developing this presentation to highlight the three core factors that have driven the maintenance of this highly unequal social order. So the first one is obviously the highly skewed distribution of assets that result from colonial settlement, from segregation, and from apartheid, which have left the vast majority, particularly of the rural population, herded onto 13% of the agriculturally viable land. Secondly, much more the fault of segregation, apartheid, we have been left with an enormously disabling spatial geography. And this spatial geography is fractal in nature. Poor people are relegated to racial poverty traps at the national level in the former Bantustans, and at the regional level in dormitory townships. Thirdly, the rise of a highly developed, capital-intensive, vertically integrated, concentrated and spatially extended core economy. The importance of the mineral and energy complex meant that since the 1970s, growth and employment has been fairly capital intensive instead of being employment rich and exclusive. So that created, in a way, the first double whammy for poor black rural people in South Africa, which is A, you don't have enough land in order to produce your own food subsistence needs, and B, the formal economy is not providing you with the jobs that can take the place of rural employment. So a long-run process of what I like to think of as jobless de-agrarianization, the creation of a surplus population that in a way is excluded from the South African economy as workers. But secondly, the vertically integrated and concentrated and spatially extended nature of the economy means that it crowds out new entrants. There's very little latecomer advantage. So that's double whammy number two. A would-be poor entrepreneur who wants to make a life as a trader or whatever finds you are not only relegated to the spatial poverty traps where most of your neighbors are as poor as you. So the market is a very hostile and a very harsh one. But you are competing within that market with some of the best resourced and most efficient and with the most efficient distributional networks, retail and finance corporations in the Southern Hemisphere. Then the other third factor, I could only have three. So the third factor, number two, is the enormously uneven distribution and undeveloped nature of human capital in South Africa, partly a result of Verwoerdian educational policy, which educated black people to a life of service, partly the result of the complete failure of our present government to renew that education system, and then, of course, the disaster of HIV and AIDS policy in South Africa. In a word, I think I'm running out of time. Added to this has been policy failure. Given that poverty is structural and the result of process of marginalization and exclusion, the dominant economic growth framework in place since 1994 has completely ignored this, has instead relied on classical neoliberal theories about trickle-down. So it's failed to challenge these broad structural features of our economy, and in some ways has even exacerbated these dynamics, leaving poor people even more marginalized now than they were 15 years ago. I'm not going to go into the rest. In the rest of my paper, I talk a little bit about the political turmoil that this is creating in present-day South African society. The ANC is unable to resolve this contradiction. The rank and file can, as Mbeki found out, expel leaders for failing to resolve the problems of poverty, but any leader foolish enough to step into his shoes will find out to their cost, as Jacob Zuma is finding out now, that they are next in line for facing the wrath of our rank and file. So in a way, we're in an extended crisis where we can't find the problems resolvable in the terms in which it has been set. So it's a bit of a dismal news, and maybe we can talk more about it in time comes for questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andries.